Welcome to Sewing Anastasia, and today we're going to be sewing a fur coat, a pink and white shag fur coat. So cool! The jacket pattern's an original Anastasia design. If you'd like to get the pattern for the month of January, you can subscribe to Patreon and it'll be emailed to you. And after that, it'll be available on sewinganastasia.com. Let's get sewing! Get excited about fabric shopping because you're going to need to buy a really cool, amazing fake fur. I chose this pink and white ombre and it has little specks of longer hairs on it. It's pretty cool. You're gonna need about 3 yards of fake fur depending on what size your pattern is you're cutting out. You can choose pink, yellow, blue, green, polka dots. It's your choice. Design it for you. You're also gonna need about 3 yards of lining fabric. I chose this really cool cotton with bows and hearts on it, because I love bows and hearts. You're also gonna need 1 yard of fusible interfacing. You're gonna need 6 buttons for your jacket. I chose these light pink vintage buttons. You're also gonna need 1 yard of 1/4-inch elastic. You're also gonna need matching hot pink thread if you're doing a hot pink coat. You're going to need your scissors and your rotary cutter. The first step is cutting out the fabric. Make sure you refer to your pattern so you know which pieces are fur, which ones are lining, and which ones need interfacing. The first ones I'm going to cut out are the fur. Now be really careful when you're cutting out the fur because there is a direction to it, also referred to as the pile. So notice how this fur has a direction to it that's going down and it lays nice and flat. If I take it and I turn it the other way, see how it gets all weird and bunchy and it almost looks wrong? It's because it is. So when we cut it out, we want to make sure that the direction of the pile is laying nice and flat and smooth down our body. So always remember to check your pattern pieces when you're working with this thick of a pile. So now we're ready to cut. So grab your rotary cutter, let's lay out our pattern pieces and cut this fur out. It's kind of like cutting a rug, right? When laying out my fabric pieces, I like to lay them on the wrong side of the fabric so that way the fur isn't getting in the way of the pattern and the rotary cutter and I can see everything really clear, but there's gonna be a ton of fuzz and fur everywhere. So keep a vacuum handy and don't let your mom catch you with that fuzz everywhere. Now let's start cutting. Okay, let's take our pattern weights off and check out our first piece. And look at all of this extra fur that's coming off. Now that we have the fur all cleaned up and cut out, go ahead, grab your lining fabric and your lining patterns, and let's cut out the lining. Voila! Now that we're done with the lining, let's grab our interfacing and cut out all the pieces that need to be interfaced. Voila! Interfacing in your face! So everything's cut out. That took forever, but it's all finished. So your pieces should look something like the ones I have cut out. So let's go over them real quick. So you should have your facing pieces and also 2 pieces of interfacing for them. You should have the front of your jacket, and then you should have your collar pieces. This is cut 4, so don't forget that. And then I also cut 4 of the interfacing. And then we're going to have the back of the jacket, and then you're also gonna have your jacket back lining. And then we're gonna move over to the lining of the front, and then this is going to be the inside facing for the front as well. Those are all the pieces you should have cut out to sew along with me. The first thing I like to do is go ahead and iron down any of my fusible interfacing So that way when I'm sewing, I don't have to get up from the sewing machine and go iron it in the middle of it. So let's go iron. Okay, so I'm going to iron the interfacing for my collar pieces first, and there are 4 of these and they look identical. It's really important to remember when you're ironing fake fur to use a pressing cloth, so that way you do not melt your fur, because that would be really sad if you spent all that time cutting it out and then you melted your fur. Okay, and now we have our interfacing on piece 1. Okay, so now the fusible should be fused to the fabric, so go ahead and do this 3 more times to the 3 other pieces. Now that we've finished interfacing all 4 collar pieces, we're going to move on to the facing. So we're going to interface the facing. That's a mouthful. So your facing piece should look something like this one that I have laid down. Depending obviously on what size you're cutting out, might look a little bigger or smaller, but should look something like this. And there are 2 of these, the right and the left, so go ahead and put some interfacing on these. Now that we're all done ironing the interfacing, we are ready to sew. I like to start with the front lining and the facing piece. So these 2 are going to match up real nicely. So you're gonna always do right sides together, and if you'd like, you can use some pins, or you can just hold it as you sew. So let's go over to the sewing machine and start sewing. When sewing heavy fabrics like fur with a really thick pile, you're going to want to put on your interchangeable dual feed foot or your walking foot, so that way it feeds the fabric on the top and the bottom evenly. Especially if you're using a cotton or lining on one side and a fur on the other, the interchangeable dual feed foot makes it like butter to sew. It's amazing. Go ahead and line up our front facing with our lining, and don't forget your seam allowance on here is a 1/2 inch. So go ahead and let's start. And look how smooth this is sewing. Fabulous. Okay, now we have our facing sewn to our lining. Go ahead and do it to the other side. So you need a right and a left. Next, we're gonna do an edge stitch, so that way our facing stays nice and flat. And it's going to be on the lining right next to our furry facing. I usually like to do it about 1/8 of an inch. So let's go ahead and do that. Our edge stitch is finished. It should look something like this, and you can go ahead and do it to your other piece. I don't know if you noticed, but I added some decorative heart stitches to the lining. I know this pattern is something that I created, but this is a great way for you to add personalization to the garment. I love adding really fun details to a lining because it makes it so personal. No one else really sees it except when you take off your coat or when you put it on. Whether you're gonna put a decorative lining in your coat, add some decorative stitches, add a giant embroidery, this is a great place to make your coat personal, and it's fashion, so have fun with it. Next, you're gonna grab your center back lining pieces, and we are going to sew together center back. Your fabric lining piece should look something like this, and we're gonna sew right down center back here, always right sides together. So go ahead and put your right sides together, and let's sew it up. Woo! We are done with our center back lining. A nice clean straight stitch should look something like this. Now we're gonna sew the front lining pieces to this back lining piece at the underarm seam. So let's go over to the cutting table, lay them out, and pin them together. Okay, so I want you to grab your front lining piece, and we're gonna line it up with your back lining piece at the underarm seam and the top shoulder. So let's go ahead and lay it out, line it up as best as you can, and then we're gonna go ahead and line it up with some pins. So go ahead and put a few pins in it. Now we're gonna go to the top arm seam. So you'll notice that my back lining piece is bigger than my front lining piece. Totally normal. It's because we are not flat cardboard paper dolls. We are humans and we have shape and curve. So that's completely normal. It will still line up, so just line it up all the way down. Perfect, we're looking good. Now that we have one side fully pinned, you can go ahead and do the exact same thing to the other side, and then we'll go over to the sewing machine and sew it up. So I have all the linings pinned together. I'm back over at the sewing machine. So let's go ahead and sew the top arm seam together first. Okay, so we have the top arm seam done, and now we need to go ahead and sew together the underarm seam where the pins are. Okay, we are completely done with one side. So I want you to go ahead and do the exact same thing to the other side of your jacket lining. Okay, so we are all done with the lining. It should look something like this. So we basically have our underarm seam sewn together. We have our shoulder seam sewn together. And if you open it up, you'll notice that we have our nice fur facing here. And we have those really fun decorative stitches that we put in here on the center, on the front panels. So if we turn it right side out, we put it on, you can imagine the lining in your coat being something like this. Now grab your stick of pins because we are going to pin together the center front panel and the side front panel right at the princess seam. So you're basically going to have a seam right here. So let's go ahead and we're going to pin the right and the left side. So remember, you always want to do your right sides together when you pin. So go ahead and take your fur pieces apart and put your right sides together. And let's pin them together. I like to just put a couple pieces, I like to put a couple pins in the pieces, not a whole ton. So we'll move around on you a little bit while you're sewing because it is thick. Okay, so now that we've pinned together one side, we're going to go ahead and pin together the other side. Perfect. So if you open these up, after you have them pinned together, you can see what they're going to look like after you sew them. So they should look something like this. Now we're back at the sewing machine and we're going to sew up our princess lines. So we just finished pinning them, so let's go ahead and sew them together. If you're going to be sewing fur, you want to make sure that you have the right tensions and settings set up on your sewing machine. And if you do have the interchangeable dual feed foot, this would be a great time to use it, or if you have a walking foot as well. So now we have both princess seams done on the right and the left front. So you can see that it blends in real nice because the fur kind of covers that seam when you sew it. Can't even see it. And if you turn it to the back, it pops out a little because it has the bulky fur. If you feel like this is really bulky when you're wearing it, you can also cut it down a little bit, but I'm going to leave mine at the 1/2 inch. So now we're back at the cutting table and it's time to grab your stick of pins because we're going to pin together the back fur piece with the front fur piece sections. We're basically going to do the same thing we did to the lining pieces where we're going to pin it together on the top shoulder seam and the underarm seam. So let's do it. Okay, let's go up to the top and pin, and just notice that one is bigger than the other. That's okay, your back is gonna be longer. So just pull it together so it matches evenly. Perfect. Now go ahead and do the exact same thing to the other side. So you want to make sure you have the right and the left side pinned together at the top shoulder and the underarm seam. So now we're back over at the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew up the top arm seam first. Woohoo! We are getting there. We have just sewn up the top arm seam, and now we can go ahead and do the underarm seam. Okay, we have completed the underarm seam. Now go ahead and do the exact same thing to the other side. We almost have a jacket. Super exciting. So I put the jacket on. It's looking pretty awesome. I always love trying my projects on throughout the process, so that way I can see what they look like and if I need to make any changes, bigger, smaller. This coat is obviously big, but it's supposed to be big because it's a big, fuzzy, furry, cozy coat. So I love the fit of it, and I think it's perfect so far. I tried my coat on. Now why don't you go try your coat on, check it out, see how it looks, give it a little stroll around the house, tag me in your project, and let's finish this jacket so we can go out and wear it. Now go ahead and grab your 4 collar pieces because we're going to sew them together at center back. So center back is the side that is completely straight. You'll notice that your center front is cut on an angle. So you want to put your right sides together, and we're going to sew up center back. So we have 2 sets, so center back here and a center back here. Let's sew them up. Okay, so let's take center back and put it under the sewing machine and sew it up. Center back is looking very straight and perfect, so go ahead and do that to your other center back for the collar. I'm back at the cutting table, and now we are going to take our collar pieces and we're going to sew one to the lining at the neck and one to the outside of the fur coat at the neck. So the side that you want to sew to the lining piece is the inner curve. Notice how it's pointier at the top and it's actually a smaller curve. So this is the one that I'm going to lay down and pin to the neckline of the lining. Okay, so now we have our collar pinned to our lining, and it should look something like this. Now I want to go ahead and pin the other collar to the self fabric, the furry side of the jacket. So now I'm going to take that inner curve of the collar and I'm going to place it right sides together on the fur of the coat. And you're going to go ahead and pin this on. It is going to be a little bulky and difficult because it is a thick fake fur, but I promise you it will work out. If you are having a really hard time pinning this, you could always use a really big hand basting stitch and just baste it together to keep it a little bit more secure when you're sewing it on the sewing machine. There we go. So now your jacket should look something like this with the collar pinned to it. This is the outside, and then on the inside you don't see anything. And this is what your collar will look like pinned to your lining piece on the outside and on the inside. I'm back at the sewing machine, and now I'm going to sew the collar to the lining and the collar to the fur. So let's get sewing. Cool, now we have the collar sewn to the lining, so let's go ahead and do the same thing to our fur on fur. Ooh, look how smooth that foot is right over a seam of fur and on fur. Amazing. This machine blows my mind. Okay, so now we have the fur collar sewn on the outside of the fur jacket. So let's go over to the table and let's measure out some elastic for our button loops. Now grab your elastic because we are going to cut some elastic strips for our buttons. So we're not putting buttonholes on this coat because it's really thick and furry. So it is a double-breasted coat. So we're going to be putting little elastic loops on one edge to get to the buttons. So my button is 1 1/8 and I've cut strips that are 3 inches long because you have to allow for a 1/2 inch at each end being sewn into the center front seam allowance. So if you have a bigger or a smaller button, you're going to need to adjust your elastic strip length. So again, my button is 1 1/8 and I'm using a 3-inch piece of elastic. My elastic is about 3 times the size of my button. So the way I did this was I accounted for my 1/2 inch seam allowance that's going to be in here. And if I try and fit my button through it, you know, it's not super easy, which is good, which means it's not going to come off when I'm wearing it. And so then you can notice that, you know, it's about 1/4 inch lower than my button here, which is good. That means it's not going to fall out of the loop when it's sewn. Basically, you want an elastic loop that isn't so big that your button's gonna fall out when you're wearing it, but you don't want something so small so that it's actually really hard to get your button into it. So you need a loop that is comfortable for your button to go in and come out, but not fall out. We're gonna pin these loops on the right-hand side of the jacket because women's jackets go right over left. If you're doing a men's jacket, it's left over right. And my first loop is gonna be right below my collar and I'm gonna space them out 5 inches.
Talk about what you're doing.
So I'm going to pin the edge of the elastic with the edge of my fur coat, and you want to make sure that your loop is facing the inside of the jacket so that way when we sew it down later, it's facing on the outside so that way we can pull it and wrap it around our button. Cool. And now you want to go ahead and space out 5 inches and put your second and your third loop down. And now I like to go over to the machine and just sew these down so that way I don't have to worry about them when I'm sewing my lining. So I've sewn down all 3 of my loops. So now we're all ready to sew down our lining. Okay, so now you're gonna take your lining and you're going to take your self fur coat and we're going to place them together, right sides together, and we're gonna sew all the way around the outside, but we're gonna tuck in the sleeves so they don't get caught. So go ahead and lay out your fur. Fold your sleeves in. So now that I have the fur laid out, right side is up, now I'm going to take the right side of the lining and lay it on top of it. So now our right sides are together. And now I want to go ahead and pin all the way around this coat. So this part takes a minute, but I promise it is worth the wait. So our sleeves are all hiding inside of here. So I have all the sleeve pieces tucked inside of the jacket.
Now I'm gonna start pinning.
Now I'm going to start pinning. We are all done pinning. So now we have the entire jacket encased in itself, and we're gonna go and sew in a big, giant, I'd call it a rectangle or a circle, but it's not, so we're gonna sew all the way around the outside of the jacket. And I bet you can't wait to know how we get the jacket right side out. I'll show you. Let's get sewing. We did it! The lining and the self fabric are together. Now we're gonna have to turn it right side out, but how are we gonna do that if it's all enclosed in itself? Well, let me tell you. Let's go over to the cutting mat. Now that we have the jacket completely encased in itself, we do need to turn it right side out. So my favorite way to do this is opening it up in the sleeve allowance. So I'm going to take a spot on my sleeve and I'm going to put 2 safety pins. And this is going to prevent my sleeve from unraveling all the way. So I'm going to leave a good 8 inches because our fur coat is really thick and we want to make sure we have enough room to pull through the hole. So go ahead and just undo the seam. You could also just leave this seam open a little bit during sewing construction and make sure you backstitch basically where the safety pins are. There's no right or wrong way to do this, preferred method. Okay, so now we have our opening in the sleeve. And I want you to dig all the way into your jacket, my hand's in here, and grab your fur and you want to pull it out of the opening. So essentially we are birthing our coat. Okay, so now we have the coat with the right sides out. Go ahead and grab your sleeves. And this is actually looking like a coat. So incredibly cool. Oh my God, it is so close to being finished. I'm so excited. Let's try it on. Looking very chic, right? So we still have a few steps left. We're gonna have to finish the openings of the sleeve. We're also gonna have to attach the 2 collars together inside so that way they don't move. And we've got to sew on our buttons and then we're done. So our last couple steps are going to be finished through this magical little hole we left open in the sleeve. Some people choose to leave this opening in the center back of the jacket. I like to keep it open in the sleeve. So we're going to reach into the sleeve and we are going to grab both of the seam allowances of each collar. You notice right now I can pull my collar apart. I want to secure them together so that way my collar is going to stand up nice and straight and be sturdy when I wear it. And we've interfaced it so it should look nice and sturdy and not floppy. So again, if we didn't secure that seam, your collar is going to want to open up and it's going to get funky. So this is a really important step, as frustrating or as hard as this step might be. The first thing to remember is to go inside and just grab both of the seam allowances with your hand. And I want you to pull them out of the hole. So if I go in, make sure everything's really nice and flat. I'm making sure it's all pulled up in the front and on the top. And I'm gonna pull this out. So now I'm going to have both, so I have the 2 seam allowances here for the collar, right? So this is what we want to sew together all the way down the neckline. So I don't get confused, I'm gonna go ahead and put a pin here, and then I'm gonna turn the jacket wrong side out. So I'm gonna go ahead and pin through both collars seam allowances. They're together on top of each other. And now I wanna go ahead and let's just pull out our collar. So some of you might ask, why didn't I just leave it the other way? Because that's how I like to visualize it when I'm sewing it together. So you could totally skip turning it right side out and go ahead and just sew the collar first. So essentially what we want to do now is take this collar and put it inside of itself so you can see that. So now we are going to sew this river here that we have going on, or this canoe boat of a collar, and we're gonna sew it together. So we wanna go ahead and sew this and pin it together. Okay, so now that we have our collar pinned, let's go ahead and sew it together. Okay, so be really careful getting your 4 layers of fur under the foot because that is going to be really thick. Now on the Epic 890Q, there is a button here that lets you press the foot up to go up higher and one to make it go down lower. So I pressed it once to go up higher so I could fit the fur under it. Don't forget about your pins in the fur. It's possible the pins are hiding because we do not want to sew over those. Now I'm gonna stop a couple inches before the end because I have the seam of the collar in the front of the jacket right here, and I don't need to go all the way to the end for the collar to stay secure. So go ahead and backstitch or fix, and we are all set. If you don't have the amazing Epic 980Q to sew through 4 layers of fur, no problem, you can still complete this. You're just gonna have to bust out your hand sewing needle and thread and sew these together. You could just use a running stitch securing it with knots, or you could also use a whip stitch. Okay, so now we want to sew together the opening of our armhole. This is probably the hardest step and the most confusing step for me. So when we are done, it's going to look something like this. So basically we're taking the sleeve lining and we're merging it with the fur. So what you want to do is lay out your jacket inside out. Now I have both layers of my lining fabric and both layers of my fur fabric. So lining on top and fur on the bottom. So you'll notice there's no lining fabric on this side, just fur, and lining is here. So now what we want to do at the opening is place our right sides together because, well, that's how we sew, right sides together always. So just remember right sides together. So you want to make sure you're lining up your underarm seam and your top arm seam when you're doing this so that way your sleeve lining does not get twisted. So let's open these up and imagine putting them together. And you can go ahead and start with like a pin or 2, but it's gonna be hard to put pins all the way around in this without poking yourself. So I just like to put a couple pins in so that way I know it's lined up properly when I go over to the sewing machine. So when we're sewing, you're just gonna have to sew a little, keep lining it up and like twisting it, and it's gonna get bunchy and twisty, but I promise you it's going to turn out. Okay, let's sew these sleeve openings together. While you're sewing, just remember to line up your lining with the edge of your fur, and the seam allowance is a 1/2 inch. Okay, so when you pull your jacket out of the machine, notice it's going to be creating this oval shape with our lining on one side and our fur on the other. That means you have successfully sewn together the opening of the sleeve. Now that you've sewn up the sleeve opening perfectly, go ahead and do it to the other side. So let's go ahead and turn it right sides out, and we're gonna stitch up that little sleeve hole and put some buttons on. Now go ahead and turn your coat right side out, and then turn your sleeve so it's inside out so we can see the lining of your coat. And now what we want to do with this opening is close it up. So we're just going to straight stitch it up. So go ahead and fold the seam allowance in on itself, and we are going to sew it up. We're gonna sew on the very edge, about 1/8 of an inch away. Perfection. We are back over at the cutting table, and I have turned the jacket right side out. It is looking fabulous, and I'm on to the last step, which is sewing the buttons. So there is a set of buttons on the other side that are here for decoration because it is a double-breasted jacket, but I've only put loops on one side, and you want to make sure when you're placing your button that you're putting it right where your loop's going to be. So I've gone, so you can see how that's on there like that. When you loop it around, I'm pulling it a little, and I've put my second one right here, and now I have one last button to sew right here. And if you need help on how to sew a button, you can reference my how to sew button video. There'll be a link below in the description. Aren't you excited? We only have one last thing to do on this coat, and it is to sew this button. So let's get sewing. I'm gonna position the button where I need it, and now I can sew it on. Okay, so I have went through about 3 times on the front, and now I'm ready to make this knot here on the back. I like to knot it a handful of times so that way it's not going to come undone when I am wearing it. If you're using a really delicate fabric, you can also put a little clear button on the back that you can use as extra support. There we go. We are finished. Let's do up this last button. We did it! We finished the coat. Look how amazing and cozy and fashionable it is. If you want to sew along with me, make sure you grab the pattern from my website, sewanastasia.com. Thanks so much for watching today. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Make sure you hit our subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, check us out on Instagram at @sewanastasia and Anastasia Chatzka. If you didn't know, I teach sewing classes here in Chicago. You can find more information on sewanastasia.com. And if you didn't know, I also have a boutique here in Chicago, so you can come visit me at 1001 North Damon Avenue and try on my collections. Thanks so much for watching. Bye!